Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shub, and together with my partner and co host Patric, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all.
All right, very nice. Patrick, how have you been?
I've been, you know, with a cautious sense of urgency. I've been going along. How about you?
Not bad, not bad. I was hoping you'd say something along the lines of that you're feeling very intelligent because I know our
Uh,
brethren and our fellow VC community usually does feel very good about themselves in terms of how
oh
intelligent
yeah.
and how
No,
knowledgeable.
but I don't want to steal your thunder. I knew you would be saying that. So
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Okay.
So how do
Yeah.
you feel?
I feel like I know a little bit, not enough, but but a little bit. I know enough to be content and happy, but not enough to feel very challenged in the world.
Exactly. I think the secret to good sleep is not worrying, and
Mhm.
not worrying might be also sometimes the result of not knowing.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So I think let's work with that as the segue. So you and I,
Nice.
one thing that we've been discussing for years and years. Quite often, as a larger topic, there's this constant barrage or a narrative, or call it propaganda, if you will, of
Hmm.
tons of different things constantly being put out in the media or popular narrative, other VCs saying things, etc. And it's usually meant well, and there's lots of opinions presented as facts and knowledge. And you and I have always had this belief: hey, is this really true? Does this actually make sense? And there's this, sometimes it feels like an ambient weight that we need to deal with, and we need to
Hmm.
make our decisions in spite of this ambient weight around us, of what the
Hmm.
general VC mentality, or call it the hive mind, if you will, right, of what
Hmm.
VC as a profession believes itself and wants us to believe, right? And I think you and I have intrinsically realized this for a few years. Maybe we wouldn't have realized this 8, 10 years ago, but I think we started getting this a few years, 2, 3 years ago, at least, if not earlier. So I was listening to this podcast from a very very successful investor, thankfully not from the VC world, right? So a little bit more credibility there. So several different asset classes, but not VC, and that person was describing how you know they had to deal with the macro narrative or the rhetoric or what was presented as knowledge during, for example, the very first wave of COVID. Then when the Delta wave manifested, what that means for the markets, right? What they should be.
Everybody was a virologist.
Everyone was a
Everybody.
biologist, right? Then when the Ukraine-Russia war situation started, everyone suddenly became like a defense expert, right, and a war expert. So he was also describing, like, there were very very sophisticated models presented on what happens to different trading routes and different business models with regards to this invasion. Then there were again many sophisticated models presented on a couple of other wars that have happened since. Now,
Hmm.
and of course, Patrick, even in the time that we've been running Fundamental, this is not it. Just if we zoom out a year, or say a couple of years, we've had, the Chat GPT moment. We've had some cascading results as a result of Chat GPT and LLMs proliferating. Last year, all of a sudden, everyone became a yen and carry trade expert, all suddenly out of the blue, right? Then earlier this year, everyone suddenly
Agents,
became
man.
agents. Then earlier this year, everyone suddenly became like a deep seek expert, right? And an expert at understanding the capex costs of AI,
But are
etc.
you understanding tariffs, Shub? Are you really understanding tariffs?
I know everything about tariffs, or as a famous person would say, no one knows more about tariffs than I do, right? Is
Yes.
that how that person would say, right? So, and what this person whose podcast I was listening to, they were saying, even though at that moment it feels like all this knowledge, or quote unquote knowledge you hear, is presented as knowledge, is presented even as facts in most of these cases,
Hmm.
it's almost invariably always completely false, not just in what they say will happen as a ramification of the events, but even the very basis of what was presented as fact is then eventually proven false as
Mhm.
to what it means and the conclusions being drawn. And a surprisingly large number of times it was then pointed out that, hey, it was actually just some assumptions and very confidently stated assertions presented as facts and knowledge, but they were just assumptions, right? And quite often, this investor pointed out that sometimes all it takes to make good investment and good capital decisions is to not get swept up in the wave of false knowledge, and just to
Mhm.
remind yourself that it's an assumption, right? Which is why the title of that podcast, and for those of you interested, you can go look it up. I highly recommend that listen. That episode is titled The Illusion of Knowledge,
Mm.
right? And since then, at least since I've heard that episode, I often ask myself, hey, am I believing into an illusion of knowledge, or is it an assumption? And I thought this could be like a interesting discussion for us to have, because we are like constantly inundated with so much different information presented as knowledge. And how much of it is truly knowledge, Patrick?
So we wanna use that, you and I, and chat a little bit about the what does it take to have good decision making. And I wanna so that's the topic. And there's multiple thoughts in my mind that I want to cover with you today. But let's first stick with the intro, the launch of the segue that you provided. Um, the most extreme version of the illusion of knowledge would be the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So the Dunning-Kruger effect is basically the illusion that you're an expert in a topic and the complete lack of self-awareness that between your self-perception and your true knowledge, you don't even realize either of those two ends are there. And that amount of Dunning-Kruger effect is probably going to be a really big reason to poor decision making, not just because you lack knowledge, but because you lack the awareness that you lack knowledge. So it's a second degree derivative problem.
Yeah.
And you know where you see that a lot? In politicians, actually, and in VCs engaging in politics. I would argue, and so I don't know if there's a word for it, or is there, Shub? Dunning-Kruger effect applied to social media. So not only do you have a Dunning-Kruger effect,
Mm-hmm.
but you show the entire world that you have one, but you don't care about it. You're just basically projecting the illusion of knowledge on other people. In doing so, you're showing the Dunning-Kruger effect, but somehow you sway 50% of your followers into not realizing that. Like is that
Yeah.
an externalized Dunning-Kruger?
I'm
Like, what do you call that?
I'm thinking of a word that could succinctly describe what you just said as a noun. Um, I'll continue chewing on it. Why don't you continue your thought?
I don't know. It's projection, right?
Hmm.
Some people would sometimes call that also self-fulfilling prophecy,
Yeah.
by the way. So, we give this all kinds of names, especially in venture land. Yeah, you need to dream big.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be unreasonable. That's something that you and I have been recently talking about, right? So you need to dream big. And it's the dreamers who get stuff done. It's a thin line between Dunning-Kruger and dreaming, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. I mean, one while you were saying, one phrase that came to my mind was navel gazing. I don't know why that came to my mind. In a strange way, you're obsessed with, what you're seeing towards yourself, and you have this distorted sense of self grandeur in a very
Hmm.
disillusioned way, where you think whatever you are saying is great, and there's no way you could be wrong, or your knowledge base is complete. Um,
I mean, if you see, we call that the illusion of the Midas touch.
yes, yes. But it's quite fascinating. There's one thing you mentioned.
Hold on. My point was not yet concluded. Can you put a pin in that for just 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay. So my point is, there might be a world, or there might be instances in this world where you're operating off such a large platform that having the Dunning-Kruger effect and projecting it into a self-fulfilling prophecy might be the reason why something works.
Mhm.
I just want to point out, number one, you need to have a ridiculously large and lasting platform, like buying a social media company, or being in a certain role in a certain government of a certain country of a certain size. That I think that becomes possible. But the vast majority of the population will actually not have access to that. And so if that's why you actually embrace a Dunning-Kruger effect, you're statistically exceptionally likely to be setting yourself up just for poor decision making and not for the positive effect of projecting that outside. So that's just something, like, that was my launch off here. And I just want to, that's exactly not who I want to be and wish to be. And I think there's maybe 10 people in this world, maybe 20 who can do it that way. So let's get back to your pin, but just wanted to conclude that.
Actually, what you said just now perfectly ties into what I was going to say. And this also relates to what you mentioned earlier about politicians being very susceptible to this, or if susceptible is the appropriate word. And in a minute or two, we'll talk about how VCs, even though we don't think of them as being similar to politicians, a large proportion of VCs suffer from the same fallacy. So in politics, the more senior the politician becomes, or the more senior a government official becomes, the way they get all of their information is through these curated one-page briefings, right? Uh, Now, again,
Heavily filtered.
the assumption is that is the complete primary information, and there's no bias, there's no filtration, there's nothing removed, nothing is curated. But look, anyone who's being intellectually honest with themselves knows that is not true. The briefing is prepared by another group and they have their own agenda. The briefing or the report prepared for those individuals is prepared by a layer of bureaucracy or
Great
government
point.
a little bit lower. So you have layers and layers of filtration, curation, agenda infusion going on. And that is only creating the layer of information for the next higher party. Which is why everyone sort of believes the previous layer to be a core kernel of truth, a core basis of truth. Something might have started with a core of truth or maybe a kernel of truth, but by the time it reaches right at the end, when it is presented in a with all the grand delusions and so on, you may have a very, very small shred of that truth remaining. Now,
and not just truth. I just want to point that out. So you can abstract something so high that it can still be called a truth. What you are saying is not just truth, but you and I use this term, primary detail. Like that gets abstracted away and filtered out.
100%. Now, I made the remark a short while ago that incredibly, as crazy as it sounds, this layering in of briefing and deriving of conclusions, deriving of opinions, and where in each layer you're further and further away from the primary data source, where at some point you just believe the one submitting the briefing is the entire truth and nothing else. It is actually, believe it or not that far from how most VCs operate. It is quite remarkable, and some of the people listening to our podcast may be like, "Hey, what do you mean? How can that be the case?" Patric,
Very easy. Hold on. Hey, have you talked to that yeah, what did you think of that founder? Yeah. Oh yeah, really great community. Okay, all right, I'm gonna talk to him.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
That was improv, by the way.
Well done, sir. Well done. I thought that was legit an actual call, because isn't that the VC process?
Yeah. Oh, wait, what? They're raising? Really? How are they doing? They're killing it? All right, I'll get on it. All right, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. The fascinating thing, for our audience, you may think Patric is just doing a skit. But Patric, how scarily accurate is it to How
I think this happens in every firm in every firm that isn't good at decision making 3 times a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Larger firms, perhaps more. Yeah.
And
No, look, I mean, I admire I admire investors, and even more so the CEOs that I want to invest in and be associated with, that constantly find ways, regardless of their stage, day 1, day 10,000, doesn't matter, find ways to cut, at least in a sampling way, through the mezzanine layers of their management, and find ways to get primary details to make prime decisions. We've been talking about that in the episode, The 3 Jobs of the CEO, which I thought was very, very good discussion. And one of them is to get the primary details to make prime decisions. So what can that look like? I gave the example back then of a large industrial CEO that I worked for and admired, but translated into founders, that means still doing founder-led sales.
Yeah.
Even in day 10,000, you need to own some accounts in order to know what those customers say during the sales process, what the sales process looks like.
Yeah.
You can also get transcripts from sales conversations from your organization. You can ask for them in a raw transcript kind of way to get that sampling. Same for customer success conversation transcripts. You can go to your shop floor, depending on what your business is. That might be your engineering team, that might be your CSF team, that might be literally your shop floor if you're a robotics company. Walk the floor and ask the people there, hey, what are you currently doing? What's going wrong here? What do we need to improve? Acquire primary details wherever you need them in order to make prime decisions. And that's one of the key things that founders need to get right. Investors even more, but founders need to get right. You're making 3, 5, 10 decisions every day. Do you really have primary details for that? Or do you have just assumptions and abstracted information? Because if you don't have primary details, you shouldn't be taking the decision in the first place.
Yeah. Perhaps, Patrick, we can, because folks listening to this may think, hey, we are making character judgments of people and professions, but perhaps we can also discuss the root cause of why, in the first place, professionals resort to these kinds of, call it, methods or tactics of doing, let's say, shortcuts or things of this sort to make decisions based on these things.
Boy, I don't know. I will offer maybe one. So I think self-awareness might be the explanation for 50% or more. I think that's sort of a lazy, easy, and obvious kind of explanation, but worth mentioning nonetheless is that it is hard to actually realize that this is where it starts, Shub. For you and me, it's very easy to realize that we have a decision to make because it's big decisions. They happen a couple of times a month, but they don't happen 10 times a day.
Yeah.
And so knowing for you and me when we are in a decision mode, very easy because it's sort of very obvious from the context. If you're a operator, you might be taking 10 decisions a day and maybe half of the time you don't even realize that you're in decision mode because sometimes indecision is the decision, right? So that can be tricky. And then that's where it starts. And even then when you realize you're in a decision, everything might be hasty. It might be quick. Yes. Someone might put a pistol to your head, say, hey, I need this decision now. And then being that aware in the moment, what is really the information that I have? It's difficult. I think that's what it starts with.
Yeah. I would agree. So, I mean, in my mind, it boils down to a root cause, which then has 2 branches into it. So, the key is to have accountability and ownership over the decision, which is very hard, right? I think we take it for granted, but it is easier said than done. And I think only a very small number of VC professionals actually fully understand what that even means in the first place. So maybe let me explain what that means. Taking accountability and ownership of your decision also means that you cannot attribute the basis of the decision to anyone other than yourself. No other individual, nothing else. So all the reasons reside within you, your work, your beliefs, right? And that is very, very hard to do in most professions, but definitely very hard in VC because of
This reminds me.
Yeah.
This reminds me of all these Hollywood movies that I've watched where there was some military or CIA component as part of the story. And then one character will tell the main character, well, Jen, your call, your decision. Like I see that a lot in Hollywood movies that have that kind of component.
Exactly.
So you're saying, hey, no, that's actually not viable. You need to own that decision.
Correct. And it sounds very cool, very poetic, but for those of you who've been in such situations in real life, it's actually hard to actually boil it down to that level and to then own the decision fully. So with most people, right, and if I have to estimate maybe upwards of 95, maybe upwards of 99%, how they sort of deal with it or cope with it is to say, okay, you know what, I'll rationalize my decision by either introducing an artificial constraint of time or an artificial constraint of heuristics. What happens is, what you would actually should have done is invested the time or invested the effort, resources, whatever, to, as you rightly said, collect and have direct access to all the primary information and then form your own view based on the primary information. But then perhaps you convince yourself that, hey, that'll take too much time. For what, again, whether right or wrong, you'll convince yourself there's too much time. And therefore you think, hey, if I invest the time to do that, I'll probably not have enough time to make a decision. So in order to make a decision, or quote unquote, to make a decision, I need to take shortcuts or do other things that save me time. Right? And as part of that process, I need to rely, quote unquote, rely on other things to guide me on the decision, or other people to guide me on the decision. And then that's how you get into it. And unfortunately, that's where the problem of relying on these briefings come, because you have artificially introduced this constraint of saying, hey, I don't have enough time, or it'll take me more time, or that'll weigh in. And therefore,
then you shouldn't take the decision.
You're right. Exactly.
It should not be you then.
Correct. Exactly. So either that's not the time to make a decision or take a decision, or what is even the bigger truth that not enough people realize is perhaps you don't even have the right tools to equip you to even take a decision in the first place. You need to level up.
I think that's where meritocracy and meritocratic culture too often gets misunderstood. People attribute it to hey, this was the performance and this was the outcome of that performance. Actually, meritocracy starts at an even earlier point. So you see meritocracy in your culture when you empower the person best equipped to solve a problem or to make a decision, because they have the most repetitions, the most context, the most information, the most experience. That's actually where meritocracy starts. It should lead to also then be visible in the outcomes, but it starts a little bit earlier. And I do admire these kinds of leaders that are able to realize that about themselves and about the organization that they want to build, is that, hey, if I don't have the correct amount of information, I shouldn't be making that call. And you know what, Shub? That is exactly what I tell my founders when they ask me about something I have clearly no expertise on. Yeah. My answer 50% of the time, whenever they ask me something, is I do not know.
Yeah.
That's what it starts with. And so that comes with me realizing founders have 1,000 times more information about practically every decision, with very, very few exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
An exception, for example, can be, how is that model? What is the playbook for that model in a different market?
Yeah.
That's an example where I will have different information than them. And example. But so that's really what meritocracy is. And if you really subscribe to it, that means giving them the power. That's not delegation. That is making sure that the decision is taken by the right person in the right spot.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting problem is And this goes back to, I think somewhere in the start of this discussion, we said something along the lines of the way VC and startup and founder culture has evolved. It's also, we place a certain premium or attribute, call it heroic characteristics, to whoever is the loudest, right? So sometimes there's this false sense of pressure for someone who says, hey, you know what, I'm not equipped to take this decision, or I'm not the right person to be saying yes or no to this question. Someone else needs to. Whereas in the same discussion, if someone speaks up very loudly and emphatically about something, and what I'm specifically thinking about here is an episode we did recently on 70% of VCs adding negative value, right? How does that actually manifest, right? As you and I know, the way it manifests is a lot of them actually, to be very frank, don't have the right knowledge basis to be weighing in very emphatically on certain topics, but they do that all the time. They do that all the time.
Is your point that the louder someone speaks, the less knowledge they have? Is that your point?
In a way, yes, but it's also, there is a harsh judgment against someone who chooses to abstain because they realize they don't have enough knowledge to act or decide.
So that, okay, but let me start with the second part. So that to me is not an excuse, because that is only your job. And I'm glad you bring that up. So people might ask us now, hey, but hold on. You just said you should acquire primary details in order to make a prime decision. And you said that the prime decision should be taken by the person with the most primary details. How do those things belong together? Very simple. Your accountability to yourself and to everyone around you is to make sure you are the best decision maker. And only after you have established that there's someone that will always have more primary information than you, and you will never reach that level, then you should be giving yourself the permission to say, hey, actually, it should be you making that decision. So, and in that sense, abstaining from a decision is also a decision. And the decision is at the very least that you think, oh, I don't really need to spend the effort here. And that to me is like, if I see that in a person, that's a red flag. If I see, in VC firms, really quickly, in VC firms, not ours, luckily, but when you talk to friends at VC firms that perhaps are in the second or third generation of successive leadership, or even worse, where the founding GPs are sort of hanging around, but they have employed partners and they've delegated firm management to these employed partners. Where you will see that is actually briefings to an investment committee being written beforehand, being shared beforehand, and investment committee members not reading the briefings and still showing up for the decision. Worse, not showing up for the decision. That is exactly where you see that behavior.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I must clarify, my use of the word abstain was not particularly appropriate. Maybe I should explain the setting I was thinking of in my mind. The setting I was thinking about was a startup meeting with investors, etc., where an investor may choose to either weigh in emphatically with their opinions or not, right? So it's not technically an abstention of a vote or anything of that sort. But for example, an investor, because they're not equipped to weigh in on a certain matter, may just choose to stay quiet, whereas someone else, through enthusiasm or a false sense of knowledge, whatever, may be very, very vocal, very, very emphatic, etc. And the popular narrative would be, hey, that person is a value add, right? Or that person has.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right? But actually, they may be just creating negative value, and them emphatically spewing out false knowledge, even though in that moment it seems like it's a net positive. Unfortunately, even the cycle perpetuates this behavior.
Yeah. Now, what I will say is I find it very easy to spot. I have to say, not that I will have 100% hit rate, so I'm not saying that, but I think I would probably have a 95% hit rate of spotting that immediately.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think of yourself there, but
I feel similarly. Yeah.
In order to fake that to an observant, mature person in the room, you have to literally come up with lies of specifics. because it's already very easy to spot when you then ask a follow-up question and it goes abstract, generic, etc. Someone has to be a liar of specifics to keep faking it to an observant outsider. But okay, I mean, I guess that takes us maybe in a different direction than what the discussion to go. What about, Shub, you and I make a point internally that we do have biases in decision making. And one of the biases that we have is we have codified our taste about opportunities, about business context, about founders, and so on and so forth. And that taste is biases. It's not discriminating biases, it's just biases. Things where we have repetitions, where we have what we say is alpha. We have a unique advantage of evaluating that opportunity and seeing things that allow us to be better decision makers. But the bigger question is, are these biases good or bad in decision making? Because the word bias has a negative connotation.
Yeah. Excellent question. I think, so my personal opinion, and I'd be curious to get your take as well. I think, look, we're all humans, and therefore certain biases are inevitable, unavoidable, maybe even necessary as part of doing what we do. The way I think of it is I go back again to first principles. I think the only way at a portfolio level we'll do well, in my opinion, is if I am stay fully responsible and accountable for all the decisions I make and can attribute the basis of my decisions to myself. For example, where what would be totally unacceptable? Okay, what would be an acceptable example of bias kicking in, and what would be an unacceptable aspect, right? If there is a trait of mine which causes me to index on certain behaviors more, on certain other behaviors less, and for whatever reason, that's how I operate, that's what I like, etc., but I'm comfortable with that decision, in my opinion, that's okay. But if I'm aware of some biases that you have, right, and I frame the story and the narrative in a way that plays into your biases, then I'm no longer the repository of the decision, and the ownership of it no longer rests only with me. I'm kind of how do I say it, tying the validity or my comfort level with the decision with the sort of hopes of stringing you along, which is not
Isn't
the
it
right
called
thing.
manipulation?
It is called manipulation. Yes, that is right. So that would not be cool. So I think there is an acceptable version of how biases get incorporated and an unacceptable version.
It's even hard for me to fathom why that is desirable to do. I mean, as a business leader and as an investor, I want the prime decision.
Yeah.
I don't want it necessarily to be my decision or the decision that by my decision, I mean the thing that I originally had an intuition would be the correct decision. Like, what do I care? In the end, I want the prime decision because that's going to make me more or less money, more or less successful, more or less happy or whatever, right? So wouldn't everyone want, in theory, the correct decision? I guess not, because there are human factors like vanity.
Yes, or there are other factors in play where the outcome or long-term or eventual success is not linked to only how the decisions play out, but other consequences related to whether the decision is a yes or a no.
You mean like I'm an employed principal at a VC firm and my incentive set is to report good news and big outcomes, etc. And that's how I'm going to influence a founder to do a fundraising that the company actually shouldn't better do.
You nailed one such example. Yes.
I think about biases that finance professor way back when taught me, Patric, biases have a negative connotation, but really they are just the brain's way to shortcut the information processing. And it's actually a biological, what was the term they used? Self-preservation mode. One such bias are instincts. Yeah. Tigers are bad for you, Shub. Tigers in the wild and meeting them is really bad for you. You should really run. Yeah. That's the brain taking a shortcut where it's not about decision making for you. It's not about, okay, now I need to acquire the primary information. Is that really a tiger that I'm seeing there? Or maybe it is a tiger and I should pet him and see what happens. No, your brain uses the bias to tell you run.
Yeah.
That is a prime example of why biases are our brain's way of making efficient decisions that we highly likely can evaluate with correctness.
Yeah.
And that's what you should try to be doing. And in our business, we call that taste. Again, about different things like opportunity, context, founders, etc. And that doesn't mean that a bias or a taste will allow you to have only correct positives and no false positives. We are missing out on opportunities that in hindsight could have delivered us a good financial return. 100% by having a taste and by having identified what decisions we are better making than others, we are by definition also moving opportunities into the non-overlapping part of our Venn diagram. But it also increases our chances of making good decisions on the things that we are moving on. So when you think of your own decision making in your startup, the point is not to say, oh, I should serve every business under the sun in my current business estate.
Yeah.
The point is focus on the things that you will be prime at in decision making and in converting and in executing, and nail that. And then over time, you can expand your spectrum and other things that you can become excellent decision makers at.
And that, of course, also includes in any rubbish you hear from VCs. Don't take that as primary information.
I'm telling you, man, if you gave me a genie in a bottle, one wish, and my wishes cannot be about my family, my health, wealth, friends, whatever, but only about society, I would use the one wish to say, let's go back to when we didn't have social media and we didn't have mobile phones. That, what would be yours?
Oof. Wow, you suddenly threw an extremely profound question at me. Okay.
So I'm coming from the perspective, sorry, just to contextualize why I said that, I think it's obvious, but the amplification of Dunning-Kruger effects would be taken away if you eliminated those two.
Maybe let me build on what you said. I would love it if it was impossible for lies or misinformation to be propagated.
Sounds like my wish.
Yeah. So, for example,
just more basic, actually.
Yeah, think of that. If the sad thing of what I said, most people in the world, including most highly educated and intelligent people, actually believe what I just said is already happened, is the truth. They don't realize that is actually nowhere close to the truth.
Yeah.
I
still do remember
everything that they read and watch is the truth and correct information.
You and I are kids from the early 80s. I remember journalism. And by that, I mean people educated in that skill and empowered to really research, really curate, be a strong gatekeeper of the truth, and being highly respected for that. Where has that gone?
Yeah, I know. I once heard someone say, for everyone advocating for citizen journalists, as I think the expression is called, right? For those of you not familiar, citizen journalist refers to if you have like a phone, basic recording setup and you document something, you can call yourself a citizen journalist. That person said, hey, if you advocate for citizen journalists, please make sure that the next time you have a health problem, you get treated by a citizen doctor, right? The next time you have a legal case, go to a citizen lawyer. The next time you have needs for any business, go to a citizen business. and conduct your life in that manner. And I think that should tell us everything
That
about,
hits home.
yeah,
That hits home. I do still see journalism in niche media, especially where the editor is the owner of the niche media. Not saying that by definition happens, but I still do see it there. But by and large, it's gone. And I think it started whatever, not the topic of the but
yeah,
yeah, that would be our genie then, I guess.
yeah,
Look, I think for founders, let's just bring this home, right? So I think for founders, just it starts with you being aware when you take decisions. What is the primary information you have on this decision? And if you don't have primary information, go sample, do
yeah.
it, and never stop getting primary details.
100%. You don't want to be the sucker at the end of a long line of curated briefings who then comes across as a fool because you relied
Yeah.
on briefings.
And by the way, that filtering also can happen when you talk, even when you talk to customers, because if at the customer level you're talking to someone that has just abstracted information away, it can still hit you.
Yes, 100%.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, another crude form of imagine your doctor didn't look actually at your most recent CT scan, but he would make judgment.
Called up someone else saying, "Hey, what do you think Patric has?"
Exactly. Imagine that person would call your doctor from 3 years ago, who then had actually data from 3 years ago, and that doctor would pick up the phone, but the receptionist. And now you ask, like that is literally what's going on in business all the time.
That's a very good example, and believe it or not, scarily accurate to how some decisions are made. Yeah.
All the time. And here's actually one. It happens more with employed CEOs than it happens with owner CEOs. That I challenge anyone to prove me wrong. Luckily, I cannot prove myself right here. This is pure business anecdotes. But I would be curious to be challenged and proven wrong that's the case. I actually do have the mantra. I don't invest, not just mantra, it's a philosophy. I do not invest in employed CEOs,
Okay. Nice.
even in public stocks. Cool. Thanks for that topic.
I really enjoyed this discussion, sir.
Yeah. Well then, I wish you a wonderful weekend, sir.
Likewise.
And see you next week.
See you soon.
Cheers.